Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. As I believe you already know, my name is Joe Palmer. Once upon a time, I made my living by writing about horse racing. Not just horses, mind you, but the people, places, and traditions that make the whole thing compelling. Now, as far as I know, racing has never claimed to build character. It develops what a man has, be it good or ill. Now, racing does have a way of crossing barriers. Certainly there are different roles and different levels of prestige for different people in racing, but you won't be surprised to see an owner and his trainer in a long and involved conversation with an exercise rider or a groom even about how their prize filly is coming along. The track has something of a gift for social leveling. I like that about it. As for me, I was born in 1904 in Lexington, but grew up in nearby Georgetown, Kentucky. My father immigrated to this country as a child. He made his living as a photographer. My mother came from Indiana. I was an only child. I traveled all of 12 miles back to Lexington to go to college. I started at Transylvania College, and then, how shall I put this? After certain broad hints from the management there, I entered the University of Kentucky, where I graduated in 1927. I stayed on at the University of Kentucky to teach college English and to earn my master's degree. And from there, I went on to the University of Michigan, where I also taught college English and worked on my doctorate. And then I had a conversation with the folks at the Blood Horse magazine. I've been looking over a couple of newspaper clippings here this afternoon. This is one of a sports column by Red Smith, longtime sports writer for the New York Herald-Tribune. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. Anyway, Red once had occasion to write something about me in his column, and this is what he had to say about this point in my life. He wrote, "It was fun to tell people that Joe was the only PhD writing horse racing in America, but that wasn't literally true. He had completed his work for a doctorate when a choice was presented. Should he write a thesis for the degree or write horses for the blood horse? He made the only decision possible for one who had grown up on the banks of Elkhorn Creek." Yeah, there I was studying and teaching and thinking I was embarking on a career as a college professor. And then the Blood Horse magazine said they wanted to hire me. They wanted to pay me money to write about horse racing. I couldn't resist. I left Ann Arbor behind and resumed life in the bluegrass. Oh, perhaps you'd like to know how Red Smith and I knew each other. Well, I met Red when we moved to New York so that I could join him on the sports pages of the New York Herald-Tribune. This was 1946. I rode horses. Red wrote whatever he wanted to, really. He was a friend of mine. That's not complete, actually. Red Smith was my best friend, closest comrade, and confidant at the newspaper. Our families played together. I admired him deeply. I'll get back to Red's column a little later. It's got some good stuff in it. So, over the years, I have been intimately connected with breeders, owners, trainers, track operators, stable hands, racing commissioners, and others. So, my view of racing is inextricably woven of likes and dislikes, of loyalties and preferences. These are, after all, the inevitable freight a man picks up as he goes about the track, and they can be stored nowhere but in his own head. If from time to time they tug at the man's typewriter, well, the man can hardly resist it. So most of what I'm going to share with you over the next bit of time originally appeared in columns I wrote for the New York Herald-Tribune from 1946 to 1952. These are some of the things that tugged at my typewriter. Perhaps I should begin by saying something about handicap racing, since the subject has a bearing on a horse I'll tell you about in a minute. In a handicap race, as I'm sure at least some of you know, if not many, every horse in the race is assigned a weight to carry based on the horse's past performance. The better the horse, the greater the weight. The purpose, of course, is to make the racing and the betting as competitive as possible. Now, for reasons you'll find in your own mind if you search carefully, a man who will insist heatedly that he has the best horse in America, or for that matter, England and the dominions beyond the seas, will recoil in shock and horror if a racing secretary agrees with him to the point of putting weight on the animal in a handicap race. You know, every owner of a great horse will agree that the ideal racing situation is one in which his horse carries 126 pounds and wins $50,000 every Saturday by 9 lengths. Racing secretaries make as much as $50,000 a year. The first $10,000 of that is for the expert work they do. The other $40,000 is for the abuse they take. In the first place, they're probably underpaid, and in the second, they don't make nearly enough. So now, having said that, I want to say something about a truly great handicap horse with a pretty good name, as a matter of fact. Exterminator. Exterminator was foaled in 1915 and lived to be 30. A gelding with no future at stud, he raced 100 times and won 50, including the 1918 Kentucky Derby. Now, Exterminator's best performance in a weight-carrying race had to be the Kentucky Handicap in May of 1922 when he was 7. This was at Churchill Downs. Exterminator lugged 138 pounds over the course and won by a length and a half over Firebrand, a 4-year-old carrying only 119 pounds. So Firebrand had a 19-pound advantage and Exterminator won. And then came the Independence Handicap at Latonia on July 4th, 1922, 17 years before that track sadly closed. Exterminator was assigned his heaviest weight ever, 140 pounds, to carry over a punishing 1.5 miles. So, well, I was a student of thoroughbred performance even then. An innocent of college age, I was sitting thoughtfully in a handbook up on North Limestone Street in Lexington, reading the Constitution or the Racing Form, I forget which, but also in the race was Firebrand, the horse that Exterminator had defeated 2 months earlier at Churchill. Only this time, Firebrand was only carrying 116 pounds, including Mac Garner at the peak of his form. Well, I thought to myself, Firebrand on the 4th of July is a good enough hunch bet for anybody, right? So, Exterminator finished a rousing 6th, Firebrand won handily, and I was, for some 4 hours, the wealthiest juvenile in central Kentucky. Yes, Exterminator and Firebrand are both gone now, as is Latonia. So is the money, but they were all grand while they lasted. I tend to tell people that for real racing, the thing to do is to run to Keeneland. It only lasts 10 days, and you'll see why. There's a social side to racing in Lexington, and 10 days is about all a man of middle age can stand. Now, this tourist's recollections of Keeneland, by which I mean my recollections, I taught college English, and it is a literary device to refer to oneself in the third person. You will find that I do it. So, to begin again, this tourist's recollections of Keeneland go back to the time it was still Jack Keene's unfinished training capital, and in particular to a May morning in 1935 when the dream that was to become Keeneland was no more than a tenuous wraith. The Thoroughbred Club was having a breakfast there, and the first thing that this wanderer saw when he walked through the door was what appeared to be a lilac bush. Well, there was a sudden disturbance in the branches, and then a full moon rose above it, a round, reddish, benevolent moon wearing spectacles. Closer inspection revealed it was Colonel Phil T. Chin with a mint julep. E.J. Tranter, who founded the yearling sales at Saratoga, was among the guests, stymied by the fact that it was his unyielding principle never to drink before noon. Right? Well, at the time, Lexington lay in the central time zone, and it presently occurred to him it probably was noon in New York, and that no notice should be taken of provincial variations. A little later, a former Governor Morrow, rove out onto a balcony and lifted up his accents and his syntax and his eloquence, and, well, before long, tradition was actually running down the steps and standing 6 inches deep in what is now the lounge of the Keeneland Club. You could almost hear Aristides pounding down the deserted track with Isaac Murphy sitting cold in the saddle. Murphy never wrote Aristides, but really that's neither here nor there. Among other remarks, Mr. Morrow said that the thin nostrils of the thoroughbred will be the first to drink from the river of life and the first to taste the undying grasses in the sweet valley of paradise. I mean, that this meant anything was doubtful even then, but most of the audience were Kentuckians who understand the purpose of oratory, which is to substitute for an orchestra. Well, out of this came a very solid structure because Keeneland's inaugural meeting opened the next year. It was fun then, and it has stayed fun, and it's based on a simple idea, and that is that racing is a rather expensive amusement and not an avenue to sudden and undeserved riches. You can't be expected to remember a thoroughbred by the name of Ballot unless you were at Newmarket when he won the Select Stakes in 1909. Ballot sired some pretty fair horses, including Tannery, who nearly broke Central Kentucky twice because he could beat anybody's horse in Lexington and nobody's horse anywhere else. When Tannery finished 8th to Gallant Fox in the Kentucky Derby of 1930, most of the older families around Lexington began digging in the basement in the hope that there were still a few pieces of silver buried there from the Civil War. Well, Ballot lived to be 33, a remarkable age for a thoroughbred, and it was decided to celebrate his birthday. This was done at Keeneland, and, well, everyone concerned should have known better. This was not too long after the repeal of the noble experiment, and the distilleries had not quite caught up with demand. The beverage provided had been allowed to cool before being bottled, but that was about all. The job of Toastmaster fell to Thomas R. Underwood, later senator from Kentucky, but at the time secretary of the Kentucky Racing Commission. Now, Senator Underwood is normally a serious, sensible, thoughtful, even cautious man, but on this occasion he allowed himself to be stampeded by a suggestion from one of the audience. And so it was that he stood up and proposed a toast to Ballot as a suckling. All right? This was drunk with a claim. Shortly later, to Ballot as a weanling, then to Ballot as a yearling. Now, as noted, the horse was 33 years old. and those first two toasts were for a time when he was 0 years old. Right? So, to steal from a Rudyard Kipling story of the man who was, a man cannot drink 35 toasts without remembering the pit he came from and descending thither. Senator Underwood always enjoyed telling that story. Lexington is sometimes referred to by visiting sports writers as a sleepy southern town. As a matter of fact, it's the sports writers who are sleepy. You see, it was the custom for many years at about 6 in the morning to race a fire engine down Walnut Street with its sirens wailing. Now, I think we all can agree that no considerate person has a fire at that time of day, right? And the real purpose was to wake up the trainers staying at the Lafayette Hotel so they could get up and go train their horses. Not many cities have the foresight and enterprise to work out such a scheme, but a good deal of the local prosperity is built on it. Right? You will realize that the local residents, having had a couple more hours of Betty by, are considerably more alert, and that this can be very important when it comes to, say, selling horses. Right? A man is in town to bid on the yearling sales is not likely to notice a splint on a colt if it's all he can do to keep his eyes open enough to avoid running into posts. Now, this department, basking in a fancied immunity by virtue of being a native of the place, was once awakened by the sirens to find itself in possession of a small card that had cost it $15. A close reading of it in the first streaks of dawn revealed that it entitled me to buy 2 tickets to football games that would be played approximately 800 miles from where I live. Well, I thought, Kentucky needs a good scatback or two, and if this will help hire one, it's $15 well spent. Many people who want to learn about horses go to Cornell, where the animal husbandry department is quite good. The proper thing to do is to sit in one of the 4 chairs in the corner between the grill and the elevators at the Lafayette Hotel and just listen, right? After that, you can go to Cornell and fill in the gaps, and you will still know things that the rest of the graduating class have not been taught. But, this is important to keep in mind, it's not always certain that the things you will learn about in that corner will be about horses. Case in point. This writer once took up occupancy of a chair next to one occupied by Mr. George Craybill. Now, Mr. Craybill said he had something he wanted to show me. He dashed off and returned presently with a small package. It was labeled Old Forester Gel. In other words, it was jellied whiskey. You eat it on things. Well, looking at it, it dawned on me that I had seen a similar phenomenon years earlier, and if it had been put to commercial use, I could have had enough money to get into really serious trouble. The occasion was this. We were having some friends in to dinner, and the companion to my joys and sorrows, noting that the dinner was rather heavy, was casting about for a light dessert. The casting was being done in the Bluegrass Cookbook. This particular copy had lost its cover, several pages, parts of others, and was ordinarily kept tied up with a string. The recipe extracted was for wine jelly. You dissolve unflavored gelatin in water, put in some lemon juice, and in this case, an entire bottle of Madeira was dumped in, the whole business put into a mold and in the refrigerator. When it was served, it looked like one of those quivering things that give children the extra energy to break windows or pull the cat's tail. When our guests looked at it, you could see the fog forming in their minds. Jell-O? They're serving us Jell-O by all the saints? But, they bit into it out of politeness, and matters took a turn for the better. Well, a few days later, one of the guests, a neighbor with more initiative than I, came running in with a blob of green material. It was a stinger, although the wrong creme de menthe had been used. It was a stinger, and it was jellied. We ate it. Hell broke out. Now, a stinger, as I suppose you know, is made from brandy and white creme de menthe. If you order one after dinner, you'll sip at it for 20 minutes or more. But if it's jellied and you eat it with a spoon, it goes down in 2. The detonation is more immediate and will convince the most skeptical. Now, you can see the multifold advantages of this. A lady traveling alone on a train, for example, is sometimes sensitive about ordering a couple of slugs before breakfast, fearing that a false or even worse, true impression might be given to passersby. But if she were simply eating jelly on her toast, no one would pay any particular attention, and she could be stiff as a mink by Philadelphia. That corner in the Lafayette Hotel is a small one, but you learned it. The art of training horses, if it can be put into a sentence, is to get your racer up to its peak without going the least bit over it. Right? One preparation too many, and your racer may show up for the big race stale. It's been the custom for many years for the turf riders, the Eastern turf riders assigned to cover the Kentucky Derby, to train briefly at Lexington before going up against the turbulence of Derby Week in Louisville. Seemed to make sense since no one the least bit short in condition has any business in that league. But it was found that the Lexington phase constituted overtraining, and people who were ready for Derby Week by Wednesday still had 3 more days to go. Right? As a result, one member of the Brotherhood demanded, and eventually got, a ticket on an outbound train midweek regardless of destination. He said he wanted to go anywhere where people didn't like him and weren't glad to see him. If you go to the Derby, you may want to reflect thusly. 4 years ago in the spring, 2 men, now not identified, laid plans that are about to come to fruition. One was planning the mating that would lead to the winner of the Kentucky Derby. The other was lighting the fire under the mash at the Brown-Forman Distillery. I say strength to them both. And as to that winner, many will hail the winner as the culmination of 300 years of selective breeding, while others will diminish him as a lucky 3-year-old forced to run too far too early in the year. For that matter, some will call it Derby and some will call it Darby and be reproved for it. An attempt to settle this matter was made a few years ago by asking the opinion of the Earl of Derby, who was over on a junket. The Earl said, "I don't care which way you pronounce it, but the hat is a bowler." Perhaps I should say a few words about the Jockey Club. Jockey Club was founded in 1894. It oversees the stud book. It promulgates rules about racing, of course, and the naming of thoroughbreds. A matter in the hands of the Jockey Club is not the same as on the knees of the gods, but the difference is negligible. The Jockey Club is indeed a body preeminent in dignity, integrity, sportsmanship, and lethargy. I am at least superficially acquainted with more than half the membership, and you could not catch better men by setting a bear trap in a cathedral, okay? But the total of their collective endeavor is considerably below the sum of their individual abilities. And I think that's all I'll say about the Jockey Club. But another group is worth mentioning. Now, this observer has sat in a good many brightly lighted halls and looked on as assorted citizens were presented with plaques, medallions, scrolls, cups, and other clutterment in recognition of their services to racing. Well, let me tell you, the sum total of all their achievement does not remotely compare to the services of horse players trying to get even. Right? A horse player ahead is just not a dependable producer for the game. He is as likely to take his earnings and go elsewhere, to dine sumptuously, to drink deep, to recreate himself, or buy a new lawnmower for his wife. Right? But a horse player hooked can be rated with a government security. He costs little to maintain and he produces steadily. Consequently, great care should be taken of it. You see, when you have a trout on the line, to change the figure of speech only slightly, when you have a trout on the line, you have a thing of rainbow brilliance, of great sparkling arts, of silent, steady rushes, of unpredictable fire and energy. You take him out of the water, and all you have is a dead fish and a disposal problem. Much can be said of taking the horse player from the track. Now, restocking is difficult and expensive, so conservation of the species, trout or horse player, is the prudent choice, and the one I recommend. Books on picking winners come in the mail now and then. I never read them because, as I see it, the pleasures of great wealth just about match its responsibilities. Still, it seems that people everywhere enjoy bewildering themselves methodically. I think this was first said of theology, but it will do to talk about using a system to bet on horses. Now, myself, when young, did eagerly frequent the old Kentucky Association track in Lexington. And in about 1921, I slapped a race meeting around like I have never been able to slap one around since. It was strictly illegal, but I was tall for my age and the track needed the money. The system employed was this: bet on horses carrying jockeys wearing green and white silks, because those were the colors of the high school for which I was newly hatched. By a happy coincidence, they were also the colors of E.R. Bradley, who was prepping a string there, and of George Collins, who had a barn full of horses all named Thistlefern or something similar, and all hot as $2 pistols. The method broke down when the subject attended one college with its own set of colors, and as I alluded to earlier, then another with a third set of colors, and I found that at the time I could not profitably bet 3 horses in one race. The inference to be drawn is a man planning a career as a horse player should not pass high school, and I suspect few of them do. And now you know why. There was this chap at Saratoga a few seasons back who had some reason to consider betting on a horse by the name of Sickle T, the word sickle and the capital letter T. Now, the program said that Sickle T was a gelding, right? But the horse the man saw in the paddock was not a gelding. Now, any other sport, this chap would have just said, mistake, but this was racing. So he said, ringer, right? A superior horse masquerading as Sickle T. So he ran under the stands, bet like anything, and won. And then the next time Sickle T came out, he looked again, bet again, and won again. Well, by this point, of course, he was so proud of his own astuteness that he took a certain newspaper man in on it. A quick check revealed that the racing records were simply in error. Sickle T was not a gelding. The man had been betting on Sickle T all along. He was dead wrong, but he had won 2 big bets. Afterwards, Sickle T went into the stud and proved absolutely sterile. This too may demonstrate something, but I'm not prepared to say what. For reasons that will doubtless be made known to us in heaven, a man who would not buy a carload of gravel without a rigid inspection or sell a truckload without a credit report will, without batting an eye, swallow a story from some racetrack tout that the fix is on in the 7th race and he's going to win a lot of money. In my younger days, when I wrote for the Blood Horse, I started a series of articles, or as I thought of them, bright saber strokes, revealing the half-truths and other matters that are encamped about the fringe of racing. The publisher, Thomas Cromwell, reviewed my first few offerings with something less than awed admiration. He told me, well, if you want to do this, go ahead, it's true enough. But let me tell you, there's no future in wising up suckers that are born faster than you can get at them. I got a letter once from a fella relating to me the story of a Hollywood producer who was relieved of a rather large pile of money by someone telling him a story and claiming to be Eddie Arcaro. My correspondent urged me to publish some remarks about touting in my column so that some of the gullible public might be saved from being taken in by the schemes of touts. Think of that, the gullible public. You know, I don't know. In the encounter between the tout and his gull, right? The one brings sharpness, a polished tail, an elementary knowledge of psychology, and of course dishonesty. The other brings dumbness, money, and a desire to profit from larceny he wasn't clever enough to create. How do you take sides? And if you do, someone will take the other. I always like to say that one man's fish is another man's poison. Fitz. Yeah, there was this fella around the track for many years known as Lying Fitz. Although how he got that name is mysterious, since he would always answer honestly when you asked him the time of day or whether he had a match. He was also kind to animals, as the story will show. You see, Fitz had this stable cat who lay asleep in the sun too long one day and was stepped on by a horse. Now, the cat largely recovered, but did lose 3 inches off of one foreleg. And Fitz watched with compassion as the cat hobbled about. And finally, he fashioned an old harness peg to serve as an artificial limb. Fitz liked to say, well, after he got used to it, he was as good as ever. Oh, in fact, better. It was wonderful to watch him, catching mice with one hand and blackjacking them with the other. For some reason, that story always reminds me of the one of the steeplechase jockey who was getting his final instructions before going out to the track. And the instructions were, now don't be scared to die and just let him run. Yeah, I said I'd get back to this column by Red Smith. In it he said he always suspected that the students in my classes must have had fun. Well, I did, and I think they did too. But he also wrote that there was evidence of an enduring respect. Yes, here it is. Years after Shipwreck Kelly's football days at Kentucky, when he was a big wheel in New York, former owner of the football Dodgers, a figure of some prominence in the Long Island social set, he knocked politely on the Palmer door in Malvern, Long Island. Is Professor Palmer in? He inquired in the manner of a small boy asking for Mr. Chips. Yes, we lived in Malvern. The boys, Joe and Steve, went to parochial school there. At one point they were studying the catechism. And one of the questions was, how many gods are there? And I said, now this is an important question, and I want you to be sure to give the sisters the right answer. So say after me, there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. So. Don't know how that went over, actually. As for me, I left the church when I was 18 years old after I had a dispute with the priest. I don't remember what it was about. There was that time my friends and I tied a cow to the altar in the sanctuary, but that's not the sort of thing you leave the church over. But speaking of disputes, American racing was severely disrupted once upon a time by what might be referred to as a passionate disagreement between the states of the North and the states of the South. The war that accompanied that disagreement was calamitous in many ways. But horse racing gained, because horse racing got Saratoga. You see, in 1863, with the southern tracks such as Metairie and Lexington slightly unavailable, a group of racing men held a meeting at Saratoga Springs, New York, a long-time health spa. Well, that meeting was so successful that they moved across the street and built a grandstand for a meeting in 1864. The first running of the Travers Stakes was in 1864. And there still exists in the spidery handwriting of one of the long-dead Alexanders of Woodburn, the list of nominations that Woodford County Nursery made to that first running. One of them, a 3-year-old by the name of Kentucky, won it, going 1 3/4 miles in 3:18 and change. In our time, Saratoga has become a symbol. It doesn't draw so many people, doesn't contribute much to the state treasury. It has an antiquated clubhouse and from which you can't see very much unless you have a box, or even better, unless you have a friend who has a box. It doesn't make money for its shareholders. Even so, anytime you want to know whether racing in New York can still consider itself a sport, or whether it's just a highly elaborate pinball machine, just check to see whether Saratoga has racing dates. Now, when this department was first learning that 2 + 2 can be made to equal 960 and 420, it was felt in the area drained by Elkhorn Creek that Saratoga was quite a promising youngster, considering that it was a relative parvenu of 1863 with no antebellum tradition at all. But the ancient Lexington tract, the Kentucky Association tract, was dismantled years ago. And with that dismantling, Saratoga became the oldest of American thoroughbred tracts and legitimately succeeded to the title of Queen Mother of racing in these states. Now, perhaps nothing is as hard to do or as expensive as to keep time from passing. But Saratoga has mastered at least the illusion of this, with the result that racing in August is a jewel. Now, jewels are expensive, of course, and the bite is on at Saratoga every bit as much as it is in Louisville at Derby time. You begin to wonder whether General Burgoyne lost the Battle of Saratoga out of military maladroitness or whether the local inns and taverns simply sapped his resources. And still, one comes to believe on slow, serene, cool mornings that Saratoga does give full value received. For the casual race fan, it's about the only place in the East where he can see racing. Elsewhere, he merely sees races, which is not the same thing at all. At Saratoga, the mornings are as much a part of the show as the afternoon. Now, this department cannot, in good conscience, suggest any uncivilized conduct as getting out of bed to watch horses work in the morning. Still, I will admit it's worth doing once. And the advantage is you will remember it a long time, and that saves having to do it again. But for those less avid for experience, I give you Saratoga just a little later in the day at the second cup of coffee time, when you can begin to see a little out of one eye. Breakfast on the clubhouse porch is particularly recommended, if only for the sublime sense of sitting at ease and watching other people work. It's the only track this side of Keeneland where they saddle the horses in the open, and the ordinary racing customer can see enough of a horse to perhaps recognize him next time out. Saratoga has kept on with its quiet ways, and its reward is that a little of the old time yet lingers. A man who would change it would stir champagne. The themes of Saratoga are old friends and young horses. And indeed, most of the important racing is devoted to finding out what kind of 2-year-olds are around and about. From the flash stakes on the opening program to the hopeful stakes on closing days, the youngsters command the major part of the stage. Gallant Fox won the flash. Whirlaway came to his full stature in the hopeful. You know, Saratoga is a reaffirmation of racing as enjoyment, of the original forces that first called it into being. Now, this department, whatever you might hear, is not a lover of the horse, but of a way of life. A way of life of which the horse was once, and in a few favored places still is, a symbol. It is a way of charm and ease and grace and leisure. Now, perhaps I shouldn't be fooling around with charm and grace at this late date, but at whatever risk of boasting, I am as good at ease and leisure as any man alive. Saratoga is a successful turning back of the pages. It's a stroll through the mirror, the slow drop of Alice down the rabbit hole. It's a month of living in about 1910, although some visitors think the hotels take that last part too literally. It is also a representation of a gathering of the clan. Nowhere, not even in Lexington, will you find such a concentration of owners and trainers and jockeys and touts and racing track presidents in so limited an area. One school of theological thought holds that the trials of this life are designed to test and strengthen us for a more comfortable life to come. We play with paste until qualified for pearl. Okay, that was Emily Dickinson. In the world of racing, this testing can be found at a good many tracks across the country. Think of steaming hot concrete at Jamaica in July. But for such as pass this testing faithfully, there is a reward appointed. It is a green and pleasant heaven. It's shaded by lofty elms. It has a lake and canna lilies and swans and a stately fountain. It has a slow, leisured pace and sometimes cool winds bellying down from the Adirondacks. You're probably thinking that Saratoga can't possibly be as pleasant as I make it. And I have to say that, well, for instance, take this fountain. I wouldn't give you a nickel to have it in my backyard. My admiration for swans has always been remarkably temperate. But the total effect of all these things and of the shaded stables behind them is often so strong that I cannot think of more than 3 or 4 people whom I actively dislike. Saratoga's ways are old-fashioned ways. After 11 months of new-fashioned ways, it's as comfortable as old slippers, as quiet as real joy. And that's Saratoga. Let us speak of Man o' War and of Will Harbin. Man o' War was as close to a living flame as horses ever get. In 1919 and 1920, Man o' War raced 21 times. He came in second once, every other time he won. He was the consensus 2-year-old champion, and the next year, Horse of the Year. In 1921, he retired to stud and eventually became the leading sire in North America. Now, at stud, he eventually stood at Samuel Riddle's Faraway Farm north of Lexington. And at Faraway, he was groomed the better part of 20 years by Will Harbin, a man born in the bluegrass who lived and breathed horses his entire life. Yeah. Will told his visitors a long and colorful tale. He put it together bit by bit over the years, and it never seemed to be quite the same because Will didn't like to repeat himself. But it wasn't so much that it varied as it grew. And so something like 50,000 people a year came to the farm to see Man o' War and to hear Will. Now, by a quirk of circumstances, this writer once got the job of showing Lord Halifax around Kentucky farms. And we ended up, of course, at Faraway. Now, Will did not know Lord Halifax, or even that his guest was the British ambassador. And he wouldn't have cared anyway, because Will always thought he had more celebrity in the stall with him than could possibly be standing by the door. But he knew a man who liked horses, and he gave the ambassador the full treatment. Lord Halifax was, to say the least, fascinated. It lasted something like 20 minutes, and the ambassador never took his eyes off the groom while Will unrolled the long glories of Man of War and the rich legacy of Man of War's sons and daughters and so on, like War Admiral and Hardtack, who was the sire of Seabiscuit. You know, listening to him, you thought you were listening to Alfred Lord Tennyson on the passing of Arthur. One story Will liked to tell involved War Admiral. One thing you need to know is that in the 1920 Dwyer Stakes, a really good horse by the name of John P. Greer was leading at the 8th pole. At the finish line, he was 2 lengths behind Man o' War. And then in 1937, the year that War Admiral won the Triple Crown, one of his main competitors was a really good horse by the name of Pompoon, the previous year's 2-year-old champion. And as Will told the story in the starting gate at the Derby, War Admiral turned to Pompoon and said, "Pompoon, my daddy broke John P. Greer's heart. Come on." Will's ending was almost art. He stood there with his charge and said, he broke all the records and he broke down all the horses. So there was nothing left for him to do but retire. He's got everything a horse ought to have, and he's got it where a horse ought to have it. He's just the mostest horse. Stand still, Red. Well, at the end, Lord Halifax turned to me and murmured, "Now that was worth coming halfway around the world to hear." It was a half-jesting comment around Lexington for many years that neither man of war nor Will could live without the other. As things transpired, didn't seem to be entirely a jest. You see, Will was felled by a stroke, and he hung on for many months, but died on October 3rd, 1947. Less than a month later, man of war died, November 1st, 1947. A few days after Will's death, the Blood Horse published an obituary for him. And in the obituary, of course, they listed his survivors, including his 6 sons, 3 daughters, his wife, and man of war. There was this fella in New York by the name of Al Berlin, and in 1944 he retired as clerk of the scales in New York. And for a time I rented his house, and in this house was a room I shared with a spaniel of middle life and great corpulence. He was registered with the American Kennel Club as Jurgen, but you know, he was never vain about it. On the walls of this room were hundreds of framed photographs, mostly of jockeys whom Al had met during his long career at the track. I personally knew many in the more recent photographs and recognized even more going back to the time when I first started saving my pennies to buy pari-mutuel tickets. It's kind of like revisiting my own life. Those photographs repeatedly flooded my mind with memories, most of them pleasant. Memories have a way of doing that, of washing away the pain of the moment. A lifetime of racing on the 4 walls of a small room. Which is not to say a great reckoning in a little room. Okay, that was a reference to As You Like It. And in it, Shakespeare was referring to the death of Christopher Marlowe, but we won't dwell on that. Oh, one of the photographs was of Laverne Fader, who once lost a race at Saratoga on one of Jimmy Rowe's horses. When something got by him on the inside, well, he was looking at the horse on the outside, right? After the race, Jimmy Rowe said to him, "Now, Laverne, remember, every horse has 2 sides." Okay. Told you that man of war died November 1st, 1947. It's strictly coincidental, of course, but this column by Red Smith was published exactly 5 years later, November 1st, 1952. I really appreciate the really nice things that Red wrote about me in this column, and perhaps you have speculated as to why he had occasion to write them. I think it's time I read you the opening paragraph. It's dateline Boston, November 1st. "This trip was made to see a football game, but the heart is too heavy for what Joe Palmer used to call children's games. Joe Palmer died yesterday, suddenly, peacefully, and many years too soon. He was 48. If I ever get the chance to talk to Red, I'll tell him that heart attacks aren't that peaceful, but nonetheless, here's the final paragraph. "Professionally, there will not be another like him. Personally, he was one of the best and dearest friends a man could have. We came to New York almost together and have worked and played and wrangled together ever since. There was a friendship that could have ended only one way, as it did yesterday." If I see Red, I'll thank him. And I'll also tell him congratulations. Good call. I mentioned another clipping I was looking at, and I'll share this with you before I go. It's dated the same day, Saturday, November 1st, 1952. A short notice from the Associated Press. It was published that afternoon in the Louisville Times. Dateline, New York, November 1st. "More than 30,000 racing fans at Jamaica Racetrack stood in tribute today to Joe H. Palmer, nationally famous racing writer of the New York Herald-Tribune, who died of a heart attack yesterday at his home in nearby Malvern, Long Island. after Major Francis Sutherland's 7th Regiment Band played the national anthem. The flags of the Empire City Racing Association were dipped to the strains of My Old Kentucky Home. That must have been something. Well, this has been a great pleasure. It's good to be back, if only for a little while, but I think all that's left is to tell you thank you and good night.